Yorkshire was once the textile centre of the world, and as I've been learning more about the region in which I live, I have found myself embarking on a fibre arts side quest. Hi, it's Nicole, and today we are starting a journey of discovery into the world of textiles and sustainable fashion. This journey does include books for those of you who are just here for that, but if you want to dive a little bit deeper with me, stick around until the end. I guess we can probably kick this off with some of the books that I've been reading, but I picked up these books partly because of a renewed interest in fibre arts, particularly knitting, but also sewing. The first book I picked up was Fibershed by Rebecca Burgess. This book looks at the disconnect that we as general consumers and clothing wearers have between the clothing industry and knowing how that relates to us. She makes a lot of comparisons between the clothing industry and the food industry, and I think that's quite natural considering that they both come out of the agricultural industries and we regulate one much more highly than the other. Seemingly arbitrarily, because when we consider that the skin is our largest organ, it seems strange that we wouldn't be equally as concerned with what we have pressed up against it. She spends a great deal of time in the book talking about the ills of a lot of the chemicals that are used in textiles, not just the textiles themselves that are like petrochemical based, and how they can be endocrine disruptors, or how those particles find their way into our waterways and all sorts of other things like that. She also talks about something that I think we don't tend to take into consideration when thinking about what might be safe for us to wear, and that is dyes. So the thing that actually colors what we wear. Fibershed itself is a collective, I believe. When I look on their website, it says, "We develop regional fibre systems that build soil and protect the health of our biosphere." I believe the idea spawned from an initial challenge that she gave herself to try to make an entire, I think it was within a year, try to make a wardrobe that was local in all ways that it possibly could be. So locally made cotton or wool or whatever raw material is going to be used in the fabric, locally made dyes, which I think also had to be natural dyes. And that project seemed to grow to become something quite a lot larger than the original idea. In the book, she gives a lot of examples of other people who have kind of joined in with this mission with her. And some of these examples extend beyond just the US, and she highlights some of the ways that people have carried on this mission, but in a way that is unique to their environment that they're working with. Having been very interested in the sustainable fashion space for a while, I wouldn't say that this book necessarily gave me a lot of new things to think about that I didn't know about before, other than perhaps a little more information on natural dyeing and specific information on what particular people and organizations are doing within this mission that she's set out. But I enjoyed being in that sort of headspace while I embarked in my own fibre arts journey. The idea of sourcing your wardrobe locally and thinking about all of those little pieces and the pros and cons as well of some of the fibres that we use that might not be the safest necessarily, and thinking about why we actually use them. Is it because the petrochemical industry has a surplus of material that they're trying to sell us? Partly. Is it because there are certain properties that synthetics can allow that is more difficult to achieve, or maybe in some instances impossible to achieve with natural materials, perhaps? But this kind of intentionality is something that, I mean, I set out for myself for this year. Intentionality is kind of the thing that I'm focusing on in general this year, and so looking at this granular level at something like clothing has been really interesting for me. After that, though, I picked up A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sally Coulthard, and this was an absolutely delightful book that I am definitely going to be getting a hard copy of for my shelves. So in general, I would say, especially from a lot of the nature writing that I read about, those books talk quite a lot about the damage that the sheep do to the countryside. And so I had come to associate sheep in general with being just sort of the bane of the countryside. Since picking this book up, I haven't fully changed my position, but I definitely have a newfound appreciation for sheep, and I think that there is some sort of middle ground that can be reached where they are doing the part that they are able to do without overdoing it. What I found delightful about this book was not just Sally Coulthard's style of writing, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but also just all of the little facts and tidbits about sheep in general. They are cleverer than I thought, they are more varied than I thought, and their history is so fully entwined with ours in lots of kind of charming, interesting, sometimes dark ways that I just never knew about before. I think in general as well, I quite enjoy histories of the world that follow just one part of things and looking at how that one point can sort of spiderweb into all sorts of other areas. It's worth noting that even though this is a short history of the world, and it does look at certain global elements, I would still say that it is largely focused on the UK, which works very well for me. I quite enjoyed that, but I think for other people they might be a little bit put off by the fact that this isn't quite as global as it's maybe billed to be. Like I said, it does go into things to do with other places, but I still feel like the heart of this book feels like it is in the UK, and that's understandable considering that the author is also British, and I think that's where her focus probably lies. And I would say that it's not entirely arbitrary because, like I said, Yorkshire, particularly West Yorkshire, was at one point the centre of the entire world in this area of wool textiles, wool and alpaca textiles. So although it doesn't have all of the pieces of the pie, this area is quite entwined with a lot of textile and particularly wool textile history. So it does make sense that a lot of the threads come back to this area. Those books sort of served as a background to my personal dive into fibre arts. And if you watched to the end of my last video, you'll know that I had started knitting my first ever sweater, which I happen to be wearing. At the beginning of last year, I set myself a New Year's resolution to knit myself a hat, and I didn't do that until the beginning of this year. So in January of this year, I ended up knitting a very simple hat, and I was quite pleased with it. And I learned a lot of techniques that were new to me, but the greatest thing that I learned is that I was able to do it. And that really sparked an interest in getting fully into knitting and wanting each project that I do to teach me a new knitting skill. And so for my next project, I decided to just try knitting a pair of socks, which I actually managed to do. And then I knit another hat. And after that, I just thought I would dive in and just try to make myself my first ever jumper or sweater, depending on where you're from in the world. I actually expected this to take about a year, and it ended up taking 2 weeks, which blew my mind and gave me an entirely inflated sense of my ability. But a lot of the things that I was reading, and also stuff that I already know from previous deep dives into sustainable fashion, really informed how I went about doing this. So one of the things that was important to me was to source the wool locally. So I went with a wool from West Yorkshire Spinners, who are a West Yorkshire yarn company. And the particular yarn that I used is spun in Yorkshire using fleece from sheep reared and shared in the UK. Another thing that was really important to me was that I didn't want to use any yarn that was petrochemical based. So no acrylic, no polyester, nothing like that, and ideally no nylon either. Even though nylon is a synthetic that comes from plants, I still kind of wanted to steer away from that side of things. So this is 100% British wool. However, one of the downsides for me is that I didn't realize until after I'd got it that it is superwashed, which means that it is coated in a polymer that helps it to be machine washable, which I personally don't mind just hand washing hand knitted garments, so that wouldn't have been an issue for me, but it was all getting quite a lot to think about. And so instead of like returning it and getting more wool that was different, this and that, I just went with this, and I'm quite pleased with how everything turned out. In future I'll probably be a little bit more meticulous on that end of things, but I'm not like crying about it. So I've mentioned that I wanted to stay away from plastics in my yarns. I also obviously want to minimize any animal cruelty, and so any yarn that I use would have to be non-mulesed. And I recognize that there is an argument about exploitation of sheep just in the fact of using wool at all. I'm trying to do my due diligence with making sure that any yarn that I source is from an ethical source that looks into the well-being of the animals. but I am aware that that argument is there. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the pattern itself. The pattern that I ended up choosing was the Spirit Week Stripes pattern by Park Williams. The reason that I chose this one was because I originally was planning on doing Kudavikika, aka Veronica Lindbergh's Stripe Hype sweater, but I had started following her on Instagram and she did an April Fool's joke where she used AI for an image, which in and of itself isn't necessarily an issue yet, but what became a big issue for me was that people were mostly politely trying to inform her on why this was an issue of using software that exploits other creatives, and she just entirely ignored all of those comments. She was commenting back on other people's comments that had nothing to do with the AI criticism, and liking other people's comments and that kind of thing that had nothing to do with the fair criticism about her use of AI. And to me, it just felt really frustrating that someone who is a creative person and a designer who would not want their work stolen would be willing to use software that exploits and steals other creative people's work just for this joke. And when called out about it, that she would just ignore it, that just felt really icky to me. And I didn't feel comfortable supporting that kind of person with my money, so I didn't. I understand that this might seem like something that is really small and doesn't matter to some people, but it does for me, and it does directly impact my industry. And I just feel like I would like to exercise my values and I would like to support my industry, and I think solidarity in our industries and across industries is really important. So I just couldn't bring myself to use her pattern. So I had a look around on Ravelry, which seems to be the website to go to for knitting and crochet patterns, and I found Park Williams's sweater design, and I'm really glad I did because I actually like quite a lot of her other designs and I'll probably be looking at those in future. And this one was so well written, really clear, and had lots of tips for how to make the garment look better, having like jogless stripes so there's not little jumps when you change colors. But this pattern turned out to be, in my opinion, the perfect beginner sweater pattern, and honestly I kind of feel like I would recommend it to anyone who is a beginner and knows how to do the basic knit and purl stitches and wants to try making a sweater. I feel like that's all you need to know going in, and then you just have at it, because my mentality going into it was that if I come across anything that I'm not sure how to do, then I'll just Google it, and that's what I did. But there wasn't a whole lot of stuff that I actually needed to Google because I felt like the pattern was pretty well written. There wasn't a lot that I needed to look up, and then the actual process was quite smooth and easy. I'm definitely going to be picking up more knitting patterns in future, and I think I will also probably be getting back to the sewing machine as well. I have a fair few other books that I'd like to get around to that talk about textiles in one way or another, so I will be looking at a few more of those in future. So it's likely that this will end up being a very casual mini-series or something, and I hope you're up for that. Obviously there will still be other books on completely different topics that I pick up and read and talk about here as well, but I hope that you join me for this little whatever this ends up being, and there will definitely be a lot of videos of sheep in fields, and I'll see you again in the next one. Bye.